Hello. We are now going to shift from the ecological foundations of fire ecology and fire adapted ecosystems that we have spent considerable time talking about. And we are now going to begin thinking about how to use that fire ecology information to implement prescribed fire. And the first part of that implementation of prescribed fire is to understand what influences, what determines fire behavior. And that is what this section will be covering. So first, let me share my screen. And on with fire behavior. So if you want to think about it on a general basis, fire behavior is as simple as, is the fire that you see there at risk for that sign? Are we going to burn up the sign? And when I was working for the International Crane Foundation, it would have been a bad thing to burn up that sign. But the basic understanding of fire behavior allows you to know, is this a problem? And if it is a problem, how do you minimize that problem? And if it is not a problem, why is it not a problem and how do you move forward? So that's really what we're getting at, is being able to look at fire, the heat generated from fire, the risks that are involved with fire, the ability to meet your management objectives with fire, all those various things we're looking at as it's determined by fire behavior. So your ability to predict fire behavior is really important in the overall implementation of prescribed fire. I want to focus on an important philosophical aspect that you all are probably aware of to some degree or another. And that is, philosophically, there's a huge difference between fire prescription and fire suppression. So prescription, meaning that you're lighting fires on purpose for a particular reason in particular weather, within particular weather parameters and on particular units of that you are interested in managing. Fire suppression means that you are encountering a fire. That fire is bad and you need to put it out wherever it is, on whatever it's on, at whatever time, with whatever weather. The training, much training that's with the National Wildfire Coordinating Group is quite good, but its inherent philosophical basis is in fire suppression. And when it is in fire suppression, it has a very different flavor that it casts on the kinds of training that you do. And when you think of things from a fire prescription basis, you have a fundamentally different foundation from which you're working. And it's important to understand what philosophical base you're working from. And much of what I will be presenting to you overlaps considerably with National Wildfire Coordinating Group, or NWCG, materials, but it's always the materials that I will present to you is always from a point of view of fire prescription, not fire suppression. So basically, fire prescription, you are choosing the weather and the fuels and the location that to manage fire behavior. But suppression, you are managing fire behavior given the weather, the fuel, and the location where you're at. So that's really the basic difference in those philosophies. And so keep in mind throughout all of this discussion of fire behavior, we have that fundamental philosophy of prescription rather than suppression. It's not bad versus good. It's important to make that very clear, but it is different. So the first thing when you're talking about fire, and this comes directly from a fire suppression philosophy, is in order to extinguish fire, you need to take away one of the three things that are necessary to have fire occur: oxygen, fuel, and heat, or an ignition source is sometimes used instead of heat. What suppression is doing is it's removing one or more of those attributes, but usually just one of those attributes. And if you remove that successfully, you will not have fire. So if you are removing oxygen from the system, say smothering a fire, it will go out. If you take away the fuel so that there's nothing for the fire to burn, it will go out. If you take away the heat source or the ignition source, the fire will go out. Removing any one component, you eliminate fire, and that's what's meant by the fire triangle. And suppression is all about how do you remove one of those elements. But there's another fire triangle, or there's another triangle that is very relevant for fire behavior, and it's probably more relevant in the prescription realm than it is in the suppression realm, but it's certainly important in suppression as well. And that is fire behavior, not whether fire is present or not, but fire behavior is determined by three basic things: weather, topography, and the fuels that are being burned. And if you want to understand that fire behavior, you need to understand how these three parameters influence the degree of fire that you have and what they are going to do. So weather is things like wind speed, direction, relative humidity, precipitation, temperature, atmospheric stability. Whereas fuels are the moisture content of the stuff that you're going to burn. The vertical arrangement, is it all packed together tightly, or does it have a lot of air mixed in? Because of course that allows a lot of oxygen to get to the fire. How much biomass is there, the fuel loading, the compactness of the fuel. So arrangement could be ladder fuels that get up into pines, whereas compactness is more of the arrangement. Size and shape of the fuels, continuity of the fuels, and the chemistry of the fuels. So conifers, for example, can have volatile oils that are in their needles at specific times of the year and making them much more flammable than other times of the year. And then finally, the third leg of that determines fire behavior is topography. The steepness of the slope, the position of the slope, the aspect, a south aspect versus a north aspect, the overall elevation, and the shape of the country that fire is occurring within a box canyon or narrowing of a canyon on ridge tops and flat terrain and so on. In flat terrain, topography has little influence on fire behavior, but it exposes you greatly to the vagaries of what the wind is doing. Whereas on a slope, both wind and slope influence fire behavior, but slope becomes much more important in determining ultimately what's going to happen with the fire. So topography, weather, and fuels all shape fire behavior. And what I'll spend most of my time talking about is weather, because that's a primary characteristic that we have in dealing with a prescription or the conditions under which we think it is safe and effective to light a fire. And again, this is prescription, and so we are choosing our weather. You can choose fuels and you can choose topography as well through developing a prescribed burn plan, and those are things that we can address as well. But principally, we'll be talking about weather in this section, a little bit on topography as it affects fire behavior, and fuels as it affects fire behavior, or at least as it interacts with weather. So for weather, primarily we're going to focus on relative humidity, precipitation, temperature, wind, and atmospheric stability. Some of these things I'm sure you're well aware of already, others you are not. But basically, each one of these things is influencing primarily how much water is in the fuel you're going to burn. And that is a really critical component of how you are thinking about fire behavior. The drier that the fuel is, the more intense that the fire is going to be. And so relative humidity, precipitation, temperature, wind, and atmospheric stability all can influence how much moisture is in the fuel that you are going to burn. Now, there are other aspects that these things have on fire behavior directly, but often it's primarily on what is happening to the moisture content in the fuel that you're going to burn and how fast is it happening. So first, relative humidity. Very simply put, relative humidity is defined as the percent of moisture in the air relative to the total amount that the air is capable of holding. So if you're at 100% relative humidity, it means the air cannot hold any more moisture. And any more moisture in the air and you will get precipitation. The precipitation will fall out of the air in snow or in rain or some or in fog, things like that. Um, because it's a relative sort of thing, that makes it a little bit more difficult to understand. But basically, as far as we're looking at it, um, air temperature influences relative humidity primarily because as the air becomes hotter, there's more energy that's available. And so water molecules can be suspended in the air more effectively. And so the ability to hold air or to hold the ability of air to hold water is increased. So basically, for every increase in 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you will get a drop in relative humidity by 50%. So if you go from 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, fairly normal in April, for example, in the course of a day, your relative humidity will drop by 50%. So if you're starting at 80% relative humidity in the early morning, you will be down to 40% relative humidity by the time you get to be 20 degrees warmer. This is Relative humidity is a very important contributor to fire behavior, especially in grassland fuel systems, because grasses will equilibrate to changes in the relative humidity within approximately 30 minutes. So if your humidity is going down, the amount of moisture that the air can hold is increasing, which means that moisture that's in the grass is going to be moving from the grass into the air at a more rapid rate. And so as that moisture is moving out of the grass and into the air, because the air, relatively speaking, is drier, that grass will then be drier. And if the grass is drier, it can ignite more readily, it can burn hotter because it is a drier piece of vegetation or biomass. So once an ignition source is applied to it, it will burn with much greater intensity. In forested situations, relative humidity takes longer to equilibrate with many of the fuels that you're going to burn because those fuels take longer. They take longer for air to move from, say, a twig or a leaf into the air once relative humidity changes. So there are lags between when relative humidity changes and when the amount of moisture in the fuel that you're going to burn um, changes. And that is something that is determined by basically the size of the fuels that you are burning. But in general, the relative humidity, it follows a somewhat predictable pattern. There are lots of exceptions to this, but in general, temperature tends to be high in the middle of the afternoon, highest in the middle of the afternoon, and lowest in the middle of the night or just before dawn, really. It's usually at its lowest amount, and then it goes up and goes down, up and down on a 24-hour cycle. Now, there are lots of times where a weather system is coming in and temperature can be quite flat during the evening hours or during the daytime hours, and you won't get that up and down rhythm. But in general, it's warmest by mid-afternoon and it's coolest by late morning. Because of that, and because relative humidity is influenced by the temperature in the air, you have an inverse relationship. So that relative humidity, when it's at its peak, you will have, when temperature is at its peak, relative humidity will be at its lowest point. And relative humidity will be highest when the temperature is at its lowest. So basically, with a high temperature, the air will have a high ability to hold moisture, and so the relative humidity typically will drop, not always, but typically. And when the air temperature is cold, it can't hold moisture as well, and so the relative humidity will tend to be higher. And in the Midwest, that's generally ranging between 20% relative humidity and 90% relative humidity. So or 100% if you have fog and things like that. And this is ranging down to about 45% is what they're depicting here. But basically, we care about relative humidity because it determines the amount of moisture that's in the fuel that we're going to burn. And the only difference between different types of fuels is how rapidly those fuels will dry off. To give you a more graphic example of what does that really mean, relative humidity is the capacity of air to hold water. And so as temperature increases, that capacity of the air to hold water increases. You can think of it as a volume of the bag. So if you have a bag and there are 10 water molecules in that bag, you can say at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, we have the air is at its maximum ability to hold water. And what it can hold is 10 molecules of water. So we're at 100%. The bag is 24, basically it's like having a small bag. If you increase the temperature by 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you would expect the relative humidity to be cut in half. And what that means essentially is that you are increasing the ability of you're increasing the size of the bag. So you're doubling the size of the bag. So on a relative basis, you could hold twice the number of water molecules in this bag than you could at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that you would cut the relative humidity by 50%. And so that's what's meant by the capacity of the air to hold water is it's basically holding more water molecules. It's able to hold more water molecules, and so it's relatively drier. If there's a lower relative humidity, it's going to be easier for moisture to move from the vegetation that you want to burn into the air. And if the vegetation is losing moisture, it's becoming drier and will burn more rapidly, and therefore it influences your fire behavior. So in general, relative humidity, we have predictable fire behavior when you have a relative humidity between 30 and 60% relative humidity. Given the fuel type and the load, it's appropriately matched to the RH, meaning that in most fuels, 30 to 60% is pretty good. The reason why we're talking about soils is, for example, when you have sandy soils such as this, if you have a 30% relative humidity in the air up here, the relative humidity at the sands, because they dry out so intensively, might actually be quite a bit lower. It could be 20% relative humidity. And so generally in sandy areas, you tend to not want to get as low in relative humidity as you would, say, in more mesic soils like you see down here. Unpredictable fire behavior occurs once you get below 30% relative humidity, and fire becomes explosive below 20% relative humidity. At 20 to 30% relative humidity, it's a lot easier for fires to escape. And above 60% relative humidity, it is so damp that it's difficult to get things to burn. So when you are talking about a prescription, under what conditions would we like to burn in the Midwest? When we talk about relative humidity as a part of that prescription, we generally want to stay within 30 to 60% relative humidity. We want to avoid getting below 30%, but we could go down as low as 20% if the conditions warranted it. And we aren't able to achieve our objectives if we're above 60% in most cases. But I'll give you some examples then as to where those averages, so to speak, can be used differently. If you are burning in these sands, as I said, you want to have your relative humidity higher, so your prescription might not allow you to go below 30%, whereas here you might go as low as 20% relative humidity. But at the same time, if you're burning at night and wanting to burn breaks, and we'll talk about burning breaks in a subsequent lecture, you could go a little bit above 60% relative humidity if you use fire behavior to create fairly hot fire, so it's burning off the additional moisture that's in the vegetation. So say you're at between 60 and 70% relative humidity, you might be able to get that to burn if you make intense heat in one area, and that boils off the extra water that's in the vegetation, and you can use that to burn breaks where it's easy to control the fire and to put it out when you don't have much for fire breaks, something that we'll talk about later. But you can still get fire to burn really well. So just put this as a chit in your head that when we talk about burning fire breaks later on in this training, sometimes it's quite appropriate to go above 60% relative humidity because we have specific objectives that are involved, and they can be met by having more moisture in the vegetation. So there are exceptions, but the general prescription is between 30 and 60% for a typical prescribed burn. And there are times when you might want to go lower than that, and there are times when you might want to go higher than that, but you need to be quite careful when you're going out to those extremes. If you look at the number of days since the last significant rain, that's a little bit of an easier metric to use because clearly, 5 minutes after a rain, everything's wet. And so how long does it take for it to dry out from a situation where you have precipitation, where the precipitation is the thing that's driving how much moisture is available as opposed to the relative humidity? In sandy soils, you can usually burn prairies within a half a day after precipitation. They dry out fast, and they can be very useful if you're doing a number of different prescribed burns and you're got more prescribed burns to do than you have days that you are likely going to have weather where you are in prescription. Having sandy soils is very useful because you can burn them at times immediately following a rain event. Then, when you cannot burn damper soils or heavier soils, when you cannot burn savannas and things like that. So, a prairie, a half day is more than enough to dry out in a sands. I've actually sometimes burned sand prairies when I've had a little bit of rain and the fire would damp down. When the rain was occurring, as soon as the rain stopped, the fire would pick right up again. It was just that immediate in terms of how quickly the sands would dry up. If you have dry to mesic soils, if you're not familiar with that term, is a Goldilocks term. It's not too much water, not too little water, but it's just right amount of water. So dry to mesic soils typically require a day of drying before you can do a prescribed burn. So your fire, if you're going to start your fire at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, the rain should stop by noon on Thursday. In savannas, because they have heavier fuels, and oftentimes we're talking about oak savannas, and oak leaves take a longer period of time to dry out, especially in the thatch. You want 2 days for those savannas to dry out, and that's typical for dry to mesic soils. And finally, in oak woodlands that don't have as much sunlight penetrating and have a higher canopy, you'd want to probably allow 3 days for those areas to dry out. With temperature, Um, and this is above and beyond the influence the temperature has on relative humidity. Basically, air temperature, as it increases, fuels will heat up and fuels will lose moisture to surrounding air more quickly. There can be a 50-degree difference in fuel temperature between sun and shade. So, and shade can be determined not just by trees, but also by slopes. So, north aspects can be very cold, whereas south aspects can be very warm here in the driftless area. Temperature can also have an impact on crew comfort. So, if you're going to safely implement a prescribed burn, and your crew gets a heat exhaustion because it's above 80 degrees Fahrenheit and they're working with fire, which is very hot, and they're not drinking enough water, you can lose the effectiveness of your crew because of temperature. And so temperature as a prescription is as relevant for your crew ability to work as it is for the actual fire behavior that you're trying to choose the weather for. Um, but basically, there can be a huge difference based on in shade or not, and in shady areas due to slopes versus shady areas or sunny areas due to slopes. There are times when I've tried to burn a bluff where I am out of prescription because I'm too cold on the north aspect of the same hill where I'm out of prescription because I'm too hot and dry on the south aspect, even though there's perhaps only 10 meters difference between those two, at the top of the bluff. So you can be out of prescription because you're too wet and cold, and out of prescription because you're too hot and dry on the same bluff. So temperature can vary quite dramatically, especially where you have topography present, and that's very typical of things like the driftless area. The predictable fire behavior occurs at air temperatures between 32 degrees and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, Fire behavior is unpredictable below 32 degrees because it's hard for moisture to move in and out of vegetation because it's frozen. So moisture will move out of vegetation through sublimation, but not very rapidly. And so the fuels typically will have a lot of moisture in them, and so they're very difficult to burn below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But say if you're burning in cattail and you can get enough heat to be generated during the winter time or when it's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you can get those cattails to burn, and that fire then, if you have a wind blowing, that fire can preheat the vegetation, dry it out, and it will burn. So generally, it's very difficult to get things to burn below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but it is not impossible. You just have to manage the fire behavior by finding other ways to get it to dry out rather than through the typical ways that we have, which is through relative humidity or wind. And as I mentioned, air temperatures that are above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, fire spreads rapidly, but your crews also tire rapidly. And so I think a crew heat exhaustion can be as important as changes in fire behavior when you're talking about temperatures above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I've personally burned in Vietnam and where it's above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's very, very difficult to maintain your effectiveness. Without drinking a huge amount of water when you're dealing with prescribed fire at that time. And so oftentimes when we're burning or doing prescribed fire in, say, Vietnam, we're doing that at night. So wind influences fire behavior because it's increasing the supply of oxygen to the fire. Pretty much straightforward and simple. It also influences the direction of fire spread. So we will talk about this more in the next lecture, but basically fire will want to go with the wind and it will go with the wind very rapidly, but it will back into the wind very slowly. And so the direction of a fire is going to tend to go with that wind. And so if you're on flat ground, the main thing that's going to influence where the fire is going to go is going to be the wind or the lack of wind um, as you are doing a prescribed fire. And lack of wind can be a big problem. We'll talk about that momentarily. Wind also can dry fuels because it's moving moisture that's moving from the vegetation to the air. It moves it quickly away from that. And so that increases that rate of transfer from moisture in the vegetation to moisture in the air. Wind can carry sparks or other ignition sources. So here we've got wind is influencing all three parts of that fire triangle. It's influencing oxygen, it's influencing ignition sources, and it's influencing the moisture content in the fuel that you're burning. So fuel, oxygen, and heat or ignition um, is all influenced by the wind. So all three parts of that fire triangle. Um, Moving air heated by convection also preheats or heats fuel that's ahead of you. So it can, if it's hot enough, it can begin a chain reaction that will build upon itself as long as there are fuels and allow that heat to continue to build. So that's another characteristic of wind. But vegetation and topography also can influence wind speed, and I'll give you some examples momentarily about that. So for example, trees can slow wind speed. So in forested areas, it takes more wind, relatively speaking, to get the same fire behavior than what you find in open prairie systems. Predictable fire behavior occurs with a wind speed of 3 to 15 miles an hour in open or prairie circumstances and 5 to 20 miles an hour in forest. So let's think about that. Oftentimes, when people are thinking about prescribed fire, they're saying, oh, you don't want wind, right? That's actually wrong because if you don't have wind, what you do is you have a calm environment. But if you really pay attention when things are calm, it's rare that things are absolutely still. What you really get is you'll get a little air movement in one direction, say west, and then another little bit of air movement to the east or to the south, and maybe an additional movement of air to the north. Well, if you think about that, if fire is being moved by what that wind is doing, you just had three cardinal directions that your fire could move from. If you're not able to predict what direction your fire is going to move from, you've got a dangerous situation because wind is controlling it. If you're on slopes, not so much of a problem because fire is going to go up a hill faster than it goes down a hill. And you know what the fire is going to do regardless of what the wind is going to do. But so in prairie areas, we say that we want at least 3 miles an hour of wind so that we know we have a predictable direction of that wind, and you don't want that wind direction to be variable. So probably the worst imaginable prescription that you can have for wind direction or wind speed is light and variable. Light winds with variable speeds. And that can create a disaster because you can't control fire when you're on flat grounds. Above 15 miles an hour, fire is moving too quickly to be able to safely control. And so you want the just right kind of wind speeds in open areas of that 3 to 15 miles per hour. In forested circumstances, winds are attenuated because there's friction between the wind air movement and the vegetation that is developed by the canopy of trees. And so you want a little bit more wind on your minimum size. So you want at least 5 miles an hour of wind in a forested circumstance. And you can go up to 20 miles an hour in forested circumstances. So you need more wind to go through forested situations in order to get the same kind of fire behavior that you would have in prairie systems with lower wind speeds. You have unpredictable fire behavior with wind speeds less than 3 miles an hour because they are light and variable. In addition to being light and variable, and that's scary enough, fire whirls are much more common to create because the heat can create very hot areas next to very cold areas, and that creates a vortex, which is what a fire whirl is based on, and they're much more easy for them to form when you have very light wind speeds. Higher wind speeds keep that vortex or that differential between cool and hot areas from forming. And when you get a fire whirl that's right next to your fire break, it's very easy to have brands that are lifted up, carried across your fire break, or with still burning leaves and things like that, and then deposited on the other side of your fire break and creating a spot fire. So fire whirls next to your fire break is a problem. Greater speeds of 15 or 20 miles an hour, depending on if you're in the prairie or the forest, are problematic and increase the amount of spotting or spot fires is a fire that's occurring outside of your unit and escapes are more likely. In addition, generally you want to avoid weather fronts moving in because they typically bring abrupt changes in wind speed and in wind direction. And you don't know exactly where they're going to occur because forecasts are often wrong. Even if they're right in terms of the overall magnitude of what they're forecasting, they can be wrong in terms of when they're coming to your particular area. And so you want to be very careful staying well away from weather fronts so that you are not affected by dramatic changes in wind speed or wind direction. Transport winds are the fire or the winds that are higher up, and they are moving smoke out of your area if you're choosing your winds right. So a transport wind are those winds that are above the mixing height. And so the mixing height is if you look in this is a great photo. You can see the mixing height. So this smoke is rising up to about this level in this zone. This is the bottom elevation of that mixing height. So the smoke rises up to this, and then it hits the transport winds, and you can see it being carried out of this area. So the mixing height is the elevation that the smoke will stop rising and start moving with the transport winds. So here, in this case, this is a great example to see this because we have our surface winds going in the opposite direction where this wildfire actually is occurring, and a transport wind taking the smoke out of that area in a different direction. So in this case, the surface wind is 180 degrees different from the transport winds, but that allows you to see those transport winds very easily and the surface winds very easily as well. It's fairly rare to have, usually transport winds are going in the same direction that the surface winds are going. Um, so the mixing height is what determines when the smoke stops rising and starts moving horizontally with those transport winds. So mixing heights should be between 1,700 and 6,500 feet high, and they should be about 9 to 20 miles an hour. Too high of a transport wind or too high of a mixing height means there's too much energy in the system, and that can create fire behavior that is difficult to control. So the transport winds are those winds aloft above your surface, and those winds are what take your smoke away. The mixing height is the elevation at which your smoke stops rising and begins to mix with those transport winds and moves out of that system. So this brings us to atmospheric stability and to talk more specifically about what makes smoke rise. And it's really pretty simple physics. Smoke will rise when the smoke is at a temperature that is higher than the surrounding air temperature not involved with the smoke. So if you look at this example, unstable air mass means that there is rising air mass. And so at the bottom, you have the smoke is at 27 degrees centigrade, and the ambient temperature alongside of it is at 25 degrees Fahrenheit. This is higher than this, so the smoke will rise. Up at this elevation, you have 17 degrees centigrade in your smoke compared to an ambient temperature of 13 degrees centigrade, smoke will rise. Now you have 7 degrees centigrade at a higher elevation and 1 degree centigrade, smoke will still rise. Now you have minus 3 degrees centigrade and minus 11 degrees centigrade, smoke will still rise. Basically, this will stop rising when you have minus 3 degrees centigrade and minus 3 degrees centigrade, it will stop rising. So if you look in this example, you have warmer air and stable air. Warmer air is the same as the ambient temperature. It will rise a little bit, but now it's 17 degrees centigrade and 20 degrees centigrade around it. And so it's cooler and it will no longer rise. And so stable air is where the air is no longer able to rise. And the height of this would be the mixing height. What you want to have is your air to be unstable enough to get up to those heights that are well enough above the ground that smoke will move out of your area, but also begin to diffuse or disperse into the broader air mass more rapidly as it's being transported out of the area. If it stays as a bulky mass and then precipitates down once it gets cold, then the smoke will come back down to the ground and become a problem. So you want unstable air, but you don't want it so unstable that this goes up too high. So that's why we have an upper ceiling to our mixing height of 6,500 feet, because if it's going higher than 6,500 feet, it's too unstable. At the same time, you don't want stable air because that's going to keep the smoke close to the ground and it will sit and not be able to move out of your able. So you want unstable air compared to stable air, but you don't want it so unstable that there's too much energy in it. So the desirable conditions for smoke dispersal is that 1,700 feet above the ground as a mixing height to 6,500 feet and transport winds of 9 to 20. This is a great picture of unstable air. You can see smoke from this column rising up and it's stopping right about here. If you take a look at an example of stable air, you can see that this smoke isn't rising all that much and this is quite low. So this is fairly stable air and is creating a problem with smoke staying too close to the ground. We often, atmospheric stability creates inversions. They tend to occur in the evening when the ground air cools more than the air above, and the smoke doesn't lift, and it might actually even sink. Um, if you have a mixing height that's too high, that atmosphere is too unstable, and that creates firestorms and things like that, which is more relevant to, say, if you have canopy fires and things like that, which are not something that we typically deal with in prescribed burning, at least in the Midwest. So overall, what we're really interested in, besides the effects on crew comfort and the risk of fires escaping from your unit, you're really interested primarily in the amount of moisture that's in the fuel that you're going to burn. And fuel is just, leaves, grass, sticks, trees, whatever it is that you're trying to burn, that's your fuel. And so you care about how much moisture is in it. And generally, if there's more than about 20%, 25% moisture in that fuel, it's just not going to burn because there's too much water in it. So fuel moisture is sensitive to temperature, it's sensitive to how many days since the last rain, it's sensitive to humidity, it can even be sensitive to topography and aspect and shade. So these are things that we want to pay attention to when we're thinking about the moisture content that's in fuel. On a daily basis, the daily weather conditions, half-hour fuels are typically grasses and forbs. So the stuff in prairies will dry out within 30 minutes. So if your relative humidity dips below 20% relative humidity within a half an hour, your grasses and forbs that you're going to burn are going to reflect that very, very low relative humidity. 1 hour fuels typically are small shrubs and branches that are less than a quarter inch in diameter, so that they'll dry out fairly quickly as well, but it takes them an hour as opposed to a half an hour. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that oak leaves are a 2 hour fuel, and this is not something that NWCG talks about too much. But oak leaves are 2 hour fuels because they've got this waxy cuticle on them. So it takes longer for air to move through that waxy cuticle from the biomass in the in the leaf to the air outside. But then once it's dried out, it takes a lot longer for that air to move back in. So that waxy cuticle slows down air exchange or moisture exchange between the leaf and the air. So what that really means is that if you're sitting on a oak forest unit or an oak savanna unit where most of the fuel that you're burning is in oak leaves, if you've got 20% relative humidity, or say you've even got 15% relative humidity, your oak leaves are there, you would say, okay, we're going to wait until, because this is a prescribed burn, so you can wait to light your fire until the humidities are within prescription so that they are above 20%. Let's say you choose to wait until the relative humidity gets to 25%. Well, once the relative humidity gets to 25% that you measure in the air, a 2 hour lag in your fuels means that it will be, if it's 6 o'clock at night when you get up to 25% relative humidity, your oak fuel leaves, your oak leaf fuels are not going to be above 25% for another 2 hours, say 8 o'clock at night rather than 6 o'clock at night, because it takes longer for the more moist air to transfer that moisture back into the leaf. So there's a lag between when the leaves are cured versus when the air is changed in the amount of moisture it can hold. 10-hour fuels is a fairly standard measure, and that usually involves a quarter to 1 inch fuels, and they basically take 10 hours to get fully dried out. So fuel sticks are a typical measure, and they're a half inch in diameter. And so you're looking at those as your measure of 10-hour fuels. So those are the things that are going to be responsive to the kinds of conditions that you have in a day, within a day, but they're also responsive to what's happened a day or two prior to that, so that they reflect the last few days. So if you've gone 3 days without a rain or 4 days without a rain, your 10-hour fuels are going to burn hotter than if you've only gone 1 day since the last rain. There are bigger fuels, of course. So there's 100-hour fuels, 1,000-hour fuels, 10,000-hour fuels. And basically, those are fuels with diameters that exceed 1 inch. So 100-hour fuels are bigger in diameter, and so they take longer to dry out. 10,000-hour fuels, are things like snags. There are some years where 10,000-hour fuels are a very important part of the prescription. If some of you remember, in 1988, it was the worst drought that we had on record. And in that year, basically snags would burst into fires and would be very difficult to put out because they were very, very dry, and they were 10,000-hour fuels and they had very little moisture in them. They were probably about 10% moisture by the time, or even 5% moisture in the middle of that drought. So that would burn very, very hot. Now, sometimes a 10,000-hour fuel will dry out on the surface, and so you'll have fire that will burn up it, but fire won't be able to continue to burn that because there is eventually so much moisture deep in the wood that fire will eventually go out because the wood becomes too dense. And so a 10,000-hour fuel still might catch fire, but it will just burn on the outside rather than burning completely to the point, say, where it would fall over. So fuel moisture content, the basic thing to keep in mind is that if you look, this is the number of days since the last rain. So 1, 3, 5, and 7. And this is relative humidity here and the fuel moisture content for fine fuels, which would be those 10-hour fuels. So what it's really saying is that when you have low relative humidity, let's look at 1 day since the last fire. So if you have relative humidity at 20%, your fine fuel moisture content will be just about 20%. And as the relative humidity goes up, so does the moisture content in that fuel. But after 3 days of drying, you'll have at 20% relative humidity, you'll have about 15% of moisture in that 10-hour fuel. And at 5 days since the last burn, you'll have at 20% relative humidity, you'll have about 10% of moisture content in that 10-hour fuel, and so on. So that's what this is saying, is that 10-hour fuels, they change as relative humidity changes, but as there are a longer period of drying, they become drier, so that you need to be careful about staying within this sweet zone of 10 to 20% moisture content in that 10-hour fuel, so it's burning just right. And as you can see, at 7 days since the last rain, you don't want to be burning that below, say, 38% relative humidity, whereas with only 1 day since the last fire, you can be burning, you don't want to, it's not going to light if you are above 25% relative humidity. So that's what this box is. This is, you want to burn when that fuel has 10 to 20% moisture content in it. And this is how drying, number of days since the last drying, affects what relative humidity is relevant to determine the overall fuel moisture in that stick. So a normal Midwest prescription for all the weather that you're really tracking on is an RH that's between 20 and 60%. On sand prairies, it might not be any lower than 30%, or near houses, or in other situations, you might want to raise that minimum relative humidity. But generally, you can have safe burns between 20 and 60%. The half-inch fuel sticks, which are those 10-hour fuels, should be between 7 and 30% moisture. 10 to 20% is preferred. You want temperatures between 32 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You want winds to be 3 to 15 miles per hour in grasslands. And in forests, you want those wind speeds to be 5 to 20 miles per hour. For direction of the winds, you have to think about the prescription or the plan that you have for lighting this fire. Are there management implications for different wind directions? So if you have a north wind, are there structures that are to the south that you don't want smoke to go towards, like a highway or a school or a hospital, or things like that? So wind direction is not is usually relevant for the particular burn unit that you have, but there's no general wind speed that is better than another in terms of a generalized prescription for the Midwest. Mixing height should be 1,700 to 6,500 feet. Transport winds 9 to 20 miles an hour. Minimum number of days since the last rain, half day in sands, 1 day in prairie, and 2 to 3 days in savanna or woods, which it is, depends upon what the canopy cover is.